People sense this about the media. Look, the New York Times, they got out of the White House Correspondents' Dinner a long time ago, and all credit due. And the New York Times has survived and thrived and grown at this moment, uh, unlike any other so-called legacy media, and all credit due to them. And look, everybody out there, I have probably spent more hours in my life arguing with the New York Times and arguing with journalists and campaigns because that was my job. But that's how it's supposed to work. And it's very rare that I felt that the person I was talking to was not listening, was not giving it a fair hearing. Sometimes they would agree, sometimes they would disagree. Most of the time they disagree, but that's okay. That's how it works. I got asked after the Romney campaign, did I think the press was biased? And I said, no. And I got a lot of shit from that, from everybody on the right, all these Republicans. Of course they're biased. And no, my point was, you know, there was a certain thing that happened with our press. And there's a fascinating comparison. If you go back and you read The Boys on the Bus, Timothy Krause's brilliant book about the press covers of the 1972 campaign, where he decided he was just going to write about the press. Read that book. And one day in the Romney campaign, I took a piece of paper and I wrote down who the leading journalists were in The Boys on the Bus and what their background was, and who the journalists were who were covering Romney, who were on the plane. And the difference was stark. And it wasn't bias, it was experience. In 1972, to cover a presidential campaign was the epitome of your career. And when you looked at who was on the bus then, about a third of them didn't have college degrees. About half of them had been in the military. They came from all over the country. They weren't all Ivy Leagues. And then when you went to who was covering the Romney campaign, and these were, a lot of them were a lot younger. Some of them, this was really their first beat. Now, more often than not, these people have gone on and done great work. But it was just sort of a different role of the press and how to treat it. And I was lucky enough to be on campaign planes with people like David Broder. And they covered the campaign entirely differently. But now, look, I'd say to all my friends in the press, don't you realize what is going to happen to you if you keep doing this? And you think that you think of some great victory that these subpoenas got knocked down. One of the great problems we've had with Donald Trump is the inability to imagine Donald Trump. And I certainly was guilty of that. I couldn't imagine him winning the primary. I couldn't imagine him winning the general. Then after the insurrection, a lot of people couldn't imagine him ever coming back. So, that was one of the excuses Republicans used not to vote to convict him. And if I had said in the summer of 24, we're going to have an army of masked men with a budget larger than the Marines, heavily armed, under Stephen Miller, a psychotic fuck, direction, murdering American citizens as a death squad, you would have said, calm down, dude, calm down. It's not going to happen. Yeah, but it is happening. And the thing to ask yourself is, what are you going to do when it's not a subpoena that shows up at your door? What are you going to do if it's like ICE or variation of ICE showing up at your door? How are you going to handle that as a reporter? Because don't think that can't happen. And if you go back and you look at how Pinochet emerged, journalists ended up being disappeared, exiled, and yet they still wrote about Pinochet. They didn't normalize Pinochet. So I would just plead with you. In the Republican Party, we used to say, don't negotiate with terrorists, which of course turned out to be just another Republican lie. But don't think you can feed the alligator and it'll eat you last, because it doesn't work that way. Donald Trump is an existential threat to everything that you believe and everything that you do. He's an existential threat to you, your family, your profession, and the country. And wake up and just accept that and fight it. It's exhausting. It's ugly. You don't want to believe it. But by not believing it is the fastest way to ensure that the worst will happen.